Hi, everyone. Have you ever felt like your emails and other communications to students are going unopened or unanswered? You're not alone, as many of our college partners have expressed concern that students aren't opening, reading, or acting on emails and other communications that they receive from their colleges. Drawing on research from behavioral science and post-secondary education studies, this webinar will share principles and tips that you can use to make student communications more effective and more actionable. My name is Camille Headlam, and I'm joined by my colleague, Julia Schmidt, and we're both from MDRC's post-secondary education team. For those of you who are unfamiliar with MDRC or just want to know a little bit more about us, MDRC is a nonprofit, nonpartisan education and social policy research organization. We are most well known for conducting large-scale randomized controlled trial evaluations to learn what works to improve education and social policies. We also use findings from our research and from other research studies to design new programs and strengthen existing ones, and to provide evidence-based technical assistance to schools, programs, and other organizations. For our post-secondary education work, this usually means that we are conducting studies and using evidence for technical assistance on ways to get students to enroll, persist in, and to graduate from college. With this goal in mind, MDRC started the OnPath project last year in the mid of 2020 amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. We were hearing from our college partners that student enrollment and persistence were declining amid the pandemic. And at the time, there were several research studies showing that colleges could use messaging to encourage semester to semester enrollment. So we launched OnPath to help colleges do two things. The first thing was to design and implement targeted student campaigns. So this is typically email and postal mail messaging to do this each semester from summer 21 to fall 22 to help more students stay enrolled each semester. The second thing we wanted to do with the OnPath project is to share knowledge on behavioral science and evidence-based student communication strategies. And this webinar is intended to do just that. It's a recording of a workshop that we've done to help college professionals learn about behavioral science strategies that can really help with student messaging. Before we dive into behavioral science, we like to give you just an overview of what we're learning about student communications. So from several research studies, we've learned that there are several principles that you should apply to your student communications to make them more effective. The first is that student communications should highlight financial aid. So this could be any type of aid that you have for students, including federal Pell Grant aid, state aid, last dollar grants, or other forms of institutional aid. When students see aid in a message, they're more likely to pay attention to it. The second principle is that messages to students should be frequent. So always include multiple messages about the same topic. You know, students, like all people, are very busy, and reminders are a very powerful way of getting people to act on something. The third principle, use multiple modes of communication. So in addition to sending multiple messages, try to send messages out using various forms. Email, mail, text message, and even postal mail is still very useful. By doing this, you ensure that, students who have different preferences are able to get your message. We're also finding that using multiple modes is good for equity reasons. Students who have, or struggle with access to housing, they might prefer email and text messages, while those who struggle with access to internet might actually prefer to use postal mail. Another sort of less easy to understand principle is that you should integrate information across departments in a single message. So what we mean by this is that typically information comes from each department. So advising will send something about advising appointments, enrollment might send something about registration deadlines, financial aid might send something about FAFSA refile. But what we find is that if you integrate information across these departments into a single message, then a student will have all the info that they need to enroll or to take a certain action in one message. Then the final principle that we'd like to focus on today is to incorporate behavioral science principles. So behavioral science is a field that has many different principles that is really helpful in understanding how people behave. And we're going to go into this in just a second. but we think that using these principles are a sure way to help your communications to students be more actionable and effective. So let's dive right into behavioral science. So what is behavioral science? Behavioral science is an interdisciplinary field that studies how people make decisions and how they behave. And it draws on research from psychology, economics, human-centered design, and other fields. And what's interesting about behavioral science is that it provides evidence-based strategies that can be adapted to different contexts. So behavioral science has been used in different human service agencies. It's used a lot in business, as you'll see shortly. And we're finding that it's also very useful in education to help communicate with students. There are many different insights that come from behavioral science, but I want to highlight three because I think they're really useful for the student experience. The first is that actions do not reflect intentions. And this is true of everyone. What we say we will do is not often what we do. You know, it's just human nature. A second principle is that human behavior can be predictable. So I think sometimes we think of ourselves as unpredictable, but research shows that people tend to behave in similar ways, especially under certain circumstances. So context matters a lot. So if someone is stressed, if they're very busy, these things are going to affect how we behave. So just keep these insights in mind because they'll become relevant as we continue to talk through behavioral principles. So now let's get a little bit more specific. I'd like to talk to you about a popular behavioral science study. So in this study, behavioral researchers were working with a large supermarket chain. You know, I tend to think of it like a Costco or a Wegmans, a chain that typically has samples out on display for people in the store. And so this supermarket, they wanted to encourage people to buy jams. And there were many different flavors of the jam. So they'll have a little test their table where people can come by, sample the jam, and then, you know, receive a coupon for $1 off a purchase, and then ultimately purchase the jam. And so on some days, they would have 24 flavors of the jams out on the table. But on some days, they would only have 6 flavors of the jam out. When there were 24 flavors of the jams out, there was a lot of interest in the table. A lot of people would stop by, they would taste the flavors, they would take the coupons. When there were only 6, the table didn't really generate as much interest. People did stop by, but there wasn't as big of a crowd. But something interesting happened when it came to purchasing. When there were 24 jams on display, even though there was a lot of interest, only 5% of customers actually bought a jam. When that number was reduced and there were only 6 jams on display, there was a large increase in 30% of customers actually bought a jam. And so this popular study highlights what's known as choice overload. And other studies have shown that when people have too many choices, sometimes it can actually be inhibiting. And so, you know, this is a principle that can apply to students. Think about how many options students might have for a course, for example, or how difficult it might be for students to figure out what courses they need each semester. Let's look at another popular behavioral science study. So in this study, researchers were working with a university hospital, and this study was focused on littering behavior. So when people would go into the hospital for their visit, researchers would actually put a flyer, just a regular advertisement, on the windshield of the car, you know, right in front of the driver's side. But at some times, the parking lot around the car was completely free of other litter, so it was very clean. At other times, the parking lot around the car, you know, there were other handbills, other advertisement, candy wrappers, just a bunch of litter around. And so researchers were looking to see what people would do with that handbill. Would they litter it or would they, you know, throw it away properly? And what they found is that when the environment was clean, when the person would come out of the hospital and see this flyer on their car and the environment around them was clean, they were more likely to crumple up the flyer and take it into the car with them. When the environment was littered, they were more likely to crumple up the flyer and also throw it on the ground. And this highlights the principle known as social influence. This shows that we're very susceptible to the environment around us and to what we think others are doing. And you can see these behavioral principles in everyday life. So on the screen, you actually see a snapshot of an Expedia page. So I don't know, it's been a while for some of us, but if you remember actually, buying a flight on Expedia, you used to get this page, encourage you to sign up for trip insurance. Can you see any behavioral science principles or behavioral science at work on this page? And what you may have seen is that there are two behavioral principles at work. The first is there's some social influence, like we just talked about. So it says 64,971 customers protected their flight in the last 7 days. So basically what Expedia is doing here is they're trying to tell you that a bunch of other people bought trip insurance and you should too. So that's really that social influence principle at work. Another behavioral science principle is loss aversion. And you'll see that here where it says, no, I'm willing to risk my $226.60 trip. And we'll touch on loss aversion later in the presentation. Okay, so now I hope those studies were helpful in giving you a little bit of a feel for behavioral science and how the principles can be applied to everyday life. So now we'd like to take you through a framework to help you apply behavioral science principles to your student communications. And so what we want you to remember is the word simpler. Each letter in simpler stands for a behavioral science principle that you can use in student communications. And so we'll take you through the principle and then show you a couple examples. So the S in simpler stands for social influence. So just like we've been talking about, social influence says that persuasion by society, peers, or a person of influence can affect people's decisions and actions. In some, people tend to follow what they think other people are doing. And we saw that in the littering study, but let's talk about how we could use that with students. So a popular way that social influence is used in communications is by using testimonials. And so in a study that MDRC did to encourage summer enrollment, what we did was we collected testimonials from students who had taken summer courses, and we shared them with other students who we wanted to enroll the following summer. So here on the screen, you can see one testimonial says, I wasn't sure in the beginning if I was going to take summer courses, but I'm very happy that I did. It helped me not to lose focus and just kept me on track. So by sharing these types of stories from other students, you make it more likely that other students will want to get the same benefits. And so they'll also do the similar action, in this case, enroll in summer. And you also just normalize the fact that students are doing something, in this case, taking summer courses. Here's another way you can use social influence. You can simply just say, this is what other students are doing. So in this line, that in an email that's supposed to encourage fall registration, it just simply says, many students at Best County College register for their fall courses in July. So it's just simply telling students, hey, other students do it and you should too. And this is something you actually saw in the Expedia message where it just said, 64,000 people purchased trip insurance. All right, so that's social influence. Let's move on to our next letter, I. The I in simpler stands for implementation prompts. And implementation prompts basically says that encouraging people to plan the steps that they will take to complete a task can move people from intention to action. So remember we said that actions do not always reflect intentions. Well, one way to help people stick with their goal is to help them plan out the steps they will take to meet it. Here's an example from a study. So in this study, researchers were working with an employer that used to offer free flu shots. Actually, MDRC used to do the same. In this study, though, the researchers were helping the company figure out the best way to get more employees to sign up for the flu shots. And they tested 3 different types of messaging. The first message, or the control message, was just the basic standard, company is holding a free flu shot. Here are the times when the clinic will be open. The second message, it's called a date plan condition. And this one actually asked employees, to write down the day of the week and the month and day that they will take their flu shot. It also used a bit of social influence. If you see that line that says, many people find it helpful to make a plan. So again, just showing you how behavioral science can be used in messaging. And then the third condition or message was the time plan condition. And this encouraged people to not only write the day of the week and the day, but also the time at which they would get the flu shot. And what they found in the research study is that this final message was actually more likely to encourage people to sign up for a flu shot. So people were 4.2 percentage points more likely to enroll when they received this time plan condition message. So how could you use implementation prompts for students? Well, one way to use implementation prompts is just to simply, provide the steps that you want students to take to do a certain action. So in this message, which was designed to encourage students to enroll in summer courses, it simply just says, step 1, review your degree audit report. Step 2, search for summer courses. Step 3, choose the classes with the days and times that work for your schedule. And step 4, register. And then there was some extra information. Students were provided with a way to reset their portal username and password if they needed to. Another way to use implementation prompts is just to simply, ask people to plan out when they would do something. So instead, or in addition to providing these steps, you could also ask students to just say, when will you actually register for courses, as a way to help them really think about a plan, like you saw in the research study. So now we're recording this webinar. So if you are watching this as a webinar, you can actually just pause your video right now if you want to do any of the activities, and then unpause once you're done. But if you do want to do this, just pause your video and take some time to practice writing implementation prompts. Think about one activity you need students to complete. So maybe register for classes, sign up for an advising session, complete FAFSA verification, and just write an implementation prompt that you could put in an email or mail letter to students, encouraging them to finish this action. Some tips to think about: put yourself in the student's shoes. What exactly would you need to do if you were the student trying to do this action? What information could help you complete it? What might stop you from acting? So for example, if it was signing into the portal, you need to know your username and password. When should a student do this? Can you help them figure out when, and where should they complete the action? Okay. So we're going to continue in the interest of time, but again, feel free to pause your video and work on this if you'd like to. And while you do that, I'm also going to stop sharing my screen right now and turn it over to Julia to continue taking you through the rest of Simpler.
Thanks, Camille. All right. So our next principle is M, which stands for making deadlines. And the idea behind making deadlines is that when you frame an action that a student needs to take as having a deadline, you're telling the student that this is an important action and that it's an urgent action, and you're encouraging them to prioritize it. So most of the time when you're asking a student to complete an action, you already have a deadline in mind. There might be a cutoff for enrollment, for example, like in this message. We say summer registration closes on May 18th, register today. May 18th is the cutoff date, so students need to act by that day. In other cases, though, you might try to encourage students to take an action in advance of the cutoff date. If you do this, you give students a little bit more wiggle room in case they don't meet the deadline that you're setting. To do this, you don't need to lie. You don't need to make up deadlines and tell students that they're going to get cut off. There's a couple of different approaches that you can take to do this. The first is, as you see on the screen, you can set sort of a suggested deadline by which you think students should do something in their own interest. So in this example, we tell students, many students at Best County College register for fall courses in July. register by July 15th to get a spot in your top choice classes. So if a student registers for courses on the 16th, they're still going to be able to take courses in the summer. They're not going to miss the deadline. But we're telling them that if they register by the deadline that we're giving them, they're more likely to get into the courses that they want. Another way that you can approach this is to try to chunk the actions in a process into different steps and set deadlines for those interim actions. And there might be many steps that students need to take to enroll in courses. For example, they may need to fill out their FAFSA before they can register. They may need to put down a payment. So setting earlier deadlines for actions like completing a FAFSA can ensure that students have time on the back end to finish the process. This idea of setting sort of these early deadlines is something you might be familiar with in your own life. A lot of times you'll get advertisements for a deal, from a company, only to find that the deadline passes and the opportunity is extended. A lot of times companies will do this to try to get more people in the door to begin with, but extend the deadline to give more people the opportunity to take advantage of their sale. So we've walked through a couple of our principles so far. We've gone through social influence, implementation prompts, and make deadlines. So now it's your turn, and we encourage you to pause the video again. On the screen in front of you, we have a sample message that doesn't have any of our behavioral science principles. Take a second to read through and think about how you can incorporate a couple of these principles that we've gone over together so far. All right. And here are some examples of ways that we've thought to include them. For social influence, one thing that we've done is added in the beginning. In fact, many of your classmates at ABC College plan to attend this fall. So again, telling students what other people are doing and encouraging them to do the same. For our implementation prompt, we've added the steps that students can take to complete the enrollment process so that they know exactly what to do and they can make a plan. For making a deadline, we've added in a deadline here. Register by August 1st to get a spot in your top choice classes. And you'll notice that this is similar to the example that we gave before, where we're not saying the enrollment closes on the 1st. We're just saying do it by this date to try to encourage students to get in the door. Next up, we have personalization. The idea behind personalization is that making information feel very personal and customized can catch students' attention and also help to guide them through the actions that we're asking them to take. One of the easiest and most basic ways to add personalization to a message is to add the recipient's name. And this is a practice that has become really common in the marketing world. We've all seen it when we get advertisements through email or through the mail. They have our names at the top. And because it's become so common, if you don't include it on your messages, students might not pay so much attention to it. It might get overlooked. Adding a student's name is a really easy way to include this kind of personalization and give your message the best chance of getting noticed and read by your students. You can do this through a lot of different platforms that folks use to message their students. You can use mail merge, some learning management systems as well. So this is something that a lot of schools have the capacity to do and are already doing. Another way to add personalization to a message is to customize who the sender of the message is. A lot of times when you're messaging to your students about something going on campus, it does make sense to just have one sender for all students. But there are other instances where it might make sense to find a sender who has a personal relationship with the student. So for example, if you're messaging a student about setting up a meeting with their advisor, you might want to make it look like it's coming from their advisor. You'll notice in the example on the screen, we've added in the student's advisor. We've also added in customized contact information for the advisor so that students know exactly what to do to reach out to that person. Let's look at one more example. In this message, we're sending students personalized information about how much money that they have from the Pell Grant, depending on how many courses they take in the summer. So here, we're giving students really tailored and actionable information that they can use to make decisions about how many courses to take and whether they should enroll in summer courses at all. This is much more useful than telling students what sort of the typical amount of money that students get or the average amount or the maximum Pell Award for the summer. This is much more specific to the student. The numbers are not approximations, they're not rounded, and it gives it this personal feel that helps students sort of able to absorb the message and make decisions based on it. All right. Next up, we have L, which stands for loss aversion. Loss aversion refers to the idea that people are more motivated by trying to avoid losing something they already have than they are by trying to gain something new. In other words, we tend to dislike losses more than we like gains. And to understand this one, let's look at an example that's outside of education. So back in 2015, researchers wanted to know the best way to discourage people from using disposable shopping bags. As someone who's from New York City, this is something I'm very familiar with because we have a bag tax in New York, trying to encourage people to, bring their own bag and not use the plastic grocery bags. But the researchers in this study looked at grocery stores in the DC metro area that had different policies about the shopping bags to try to figure out which kind of situation would encourage people to use disposable bags less often. So some stores were in counties that had a mandatory 5-cent tax on using disposable bags. So essentially a loss of 5 cents if you used a disposable bag. On top of that, some stores had, an optional 5-cent bonus they gave to their customers who brought their own bags and didn't use any disposable bags. So this led to 4 different kinds of stores. There were some stores that had no incentive to bring your own bag and not use the disposable bags. Some stores that had a 5-cent tax or a 5-cent loss if you used a disposable bag. Some stores that had a 5-cent bonus or a gain if you brought your own bag. And some stores that had both a bonus and a tax, which led to like a 10-cent difference between bringing your own bag and using a disposable bag. So they wanted to know which would be most effective in getting people to use fewer bags, and they were particularly interested in the 2 different kinds of stores that had a 5-cent difference. One was a gain and one was a loss. What they found was that, not surprisingly, when there was no incentive all the way over on the left, no incentive to bring your own bag and not use a disposable one, a lot of people used the disposable bags. And when there was a big incentive of 10 cents to bring your own bag and not use a disposable one, only half as many people used a disposable bag. But what's really interesting is that in the 2 different conditions where there was only a 5-cent difference, people who had a tax acted like people who had both a tax and a bonus, and people who only had a bonus acted just like people who had no incentive at all. So what we see from this is that people were more motivated to not lose 5 cents than they were to gain 5 cents. So when that applies to our students, we should think about ways that we can try to frame opportunities as losses rather than gains. So one way to think about this is that when we're messaging students in this example, we tell them, don't miss out on the opportunity to take advantage of your funding and get ahead in your education. We're framing the students' opportunity to take courses and the funding that they have available to them as something that they already have, it belongs to them, and that they stand to lose if they don't register for courses. Let's take another look at this message and try to incorporate the 2 new principles that we've added. So we've added in personalization to our repertoire and also loss aversion. Here's the message that we worked on together before. Take a minute to pause the video and think about a way that you can incorporate some personalization. There's a couple of different ways you can put it in here, as well as loss aversion. All right, so starting with personalization, a couple of ways that we've added it in. One is adding the student's name, as we talked about before, as well as adding the advisor's name at the end. A couple other ways that we've added this as well. When we talk about the steps that a student should take to enroll, we mention their major. So we show that we're thinking about who they are and that we know who they are. This is personalized to them. We also tell them, earlier we had said, keep in mind that the Community College Opportunity Grant can help students cover their tuition, but now we're turning it to be much more focused on the students. So we say, keep in mind that you are eligible for the Community College Opportunity Grant, and this means that you have funding. We're making it about the students, that they know what opportunities that they have. In terms of loss aversion, we've added a phrase at the beginning. I want to make sure that you don't miss out on this opportunity. So we're framing the opportunity as a loss, or as something that the student stands to lose. All right, continuing on, our next principle is ease. And ease is the idea that we want to make things easy for a student to attend to. We all know that sometimes when we're trying to get students to take an action like complete verification for their FAFSA, or come in and meet with you, or register before the last second, it can feel like an uphill battle. And similarly, in our own lives, we know that there are examples where, despite our best intentions, we don't follow through on actions that we know are good for us. Such as remembering to wake up early and go to the gym before work. We have every intention of doing something good for ourselves, but for whatever reason, we don't follow through. The reason why a student or any of us might not follow through on any given action can vary, but the idea behind ease is that the more that you can do to eliminate barriers and reduce the complexity of a task, the easier it's going to be for students to follow through on their intentions. Let's look at some examples. So in this first example, we're thinking about one barrier that students might face to enrolling in courses, and that might be to choose their own classes. This message tries to address that barrier. It says, I took some time to run a degree audit for you. According to Southern States system, you are a business management major, so there's some personalization in there as well. Here are a few courses that you still need for your degree that are offered this summer. And then we list the courses and the course numbers. This eliminates the step for students. They don't need to think about what they've taken, what they need to take next. You'll also notice that we've added the course names and the course numbers together so that students can more easily find it in the system when they go to register. And you might be thinking, if I just send students a link to the, the course catalog, they'll probably get here on their own. And while that might be true for some students, other students might get tripped up. So eliminating that barrier might get more students in the door. When we're thinking about ease, there are a couple of other things that we can think about in our messages. One is you should think about the ease of actually reading the message. Put yourself in a student's shoes, as we've said before. When you look at your email or your letter, what does your eye go to? A lot of times using colors or bolds can make it easier for a student to read and pick out the information that's most important, which can then lead them to take that action that you're asking them to take. All right, and our last principle is R, which stands for reminders. We're probably all familiar with this idea that setting reminders can help us remember to complete outstanding tasks. And when you reach out to your students at any given time, there are many other things that they might be juggling, and it might cause them to not take action right away. So following up with smart and frequent reminders can be a huge help to students. Let's look at an example together. So when you're messaging students about registering for their courses, you could just send one email at the beginning of the registration period, right when registration opens. But if a student has other things going on and they don't take action right away, you're placing more mental effort on the student to remember to register at some point in the next 4 weeks before the deadline. Instead, think about when your registration period closes and try to space reminders out over the course of time. So for example, you can send an email on the 1st of the month, followed by a letter on the 15th, a text message on the 24th, and one final email at the end of the month right before the deadline. This takes into account the fact that students have a lot on their mind and might need help remembering what to do and when to do it by. All right. So now we've covered the last two principles in our model. We've covered ease and reminders. You know the drill. Take a second and think about how you can incorporate those into this message. All right, and here are some examples of things that we've done. So first of all, we talked about ease being trying to make something more salient in your message. We can add in right at the top, summer registration is now open. We can bold it as well so that it catches students' eye. They know what this is about. In terms of our steps that we give the students to take, we've added in a link so that students don't need to go looking for the information they need in order to take the action. And same here with giving the contact information for the advisor. When we think about what reminders might look like in an email, it's less so sort of a piece of text that would go in the email and more about the frequency of reminders as we talked about with the schedule. One more thing I want to add before we move on from the sample message that we've put together is that we've packed a lot of behavioral science principles into this message. When you're composing your messages to students, you don't need to have every single simpler principle in order to have an effective message. Try to think about incorporating one or two or even three to try to make your message more effective without making it too long. That's sort of a central tension that we're always thinking about. How can we make our messages effective, but still keep them brief so that students can get to the main point? And I know I said we were done, but we actually have one more bonus principle for you today. Our last one is reciprocity, which isn't technically part of our simpler framework, but sometimes we like to think of it as the second R in simpler because it's so important to the way that we talk to and message with other people. The idea behind reciprocity is that if you know that someone else has done a task for you or done an action on your behalf, you might feel more motivated to reciprocate or to respond in kind. So when we think about what that means for students, if a student knows that you've done something on their behalf, they might be sort of more willing to follow through and finish the task, or to sort of pay you back, to return the favor. Let's look at an example. So returning to our degree audit message with the idea for the sample courses, we start out the message by saying, I took some time to run a degree audit for you. We're showing that somebody has taken the time to help a student figure out what courses they're going to take, which might make the student feel more motivated to actually go ahead and take those courses now that somebody's already taken some of the steps on their behalf. And that brings us to the end. So we've covered a lot of different principles today. We've talked about social influence, which is, the idea that we want to tell students what other people are doing to encourage them to take those actions as well. Implementation prompts, encouraging people to make a plan and lay out the steps that they're going to take to follow through. Make deadlines to frame something as urgent and important and try to help students prioritize it. Personalization to catch someone's attention and give them more actionable information. Loss aversion to frame things as losses rather than gains. Ease in all different kinds of ways, trying to eliminate barriers for students so they can easily take an action you're asking them to take. Reminders that students don't have the mental effort on themselves to remember to take an action. They have steps along the way that are pushing them towards that goal. And reciprocity, trying to encourage students to do something in kind. Then I'm going to pass it back to my colleague Camille to close us out today.
Great, thanks, Julia. So as Julia mentioned, a common question that we always get is, should I use all of these principles? And as Julia told you, the answer is no. Feel free to use just one or two principles in each of your message, but the simpler framework can help you remember all of them. And then a second question is, are these all of the behavioral science principles? And the answer to that is also no. So simpler just covers a few principles, but there are others. If you remember in the beginning of the presentation, we talked about choice overload. So we encourage you to continue to learn more about behavioral science principles. Simpler can help you with some, and there are other resources that you can use. A very popular book on behavioral science is called Nudge. It goes through different research on behavioral science in a very easy to understand, digestible manner. And you see that there on the screen. You can also look at MDRC's Ease Handbook for Community Colleges. This handbook is about the summer enrollment messaging study that MDRC did that was shown to increase enrollment in the summer term. In the back of the handbook, in the appendix, you can find more behavioral science principles and sample copies of messaging that you could use and adapt. Also, if you're interested in learning more about the research studies discussed in this presentation, we have the citations there on the screen for you, and you can see those. You can also go to the MDRC website to just see more about behavioral science from our Center for Applied Behavioral Science and our post-secondary education research. In the future, we will have more information and messages as part of the OnPath project. And we would like to say a big thank you to our funders of the OnPath project, Ascendium Education Group, and the ECMC Foundation. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for listening.